Springs are elastic objects. Because springs are elastic, elastic potential energy is stored within them. The potential energy in a spring is stored as a result of applying a force to deform or stretch a spring. It is stored until the spring is stretched and released and then returned to its original shape. So does the potential energy of springs change when they are in different configurations? The problem being studied in this experiment is the relationship between configuration of springs and potential energy. To determine this, 3 different trials took place with force and displacement measured for each trial. Each trial consisted of a different configuration of springs, parallel, series, and a combination of the two. We initially predicted that the parallel configuration would be the hardest to pull with the highest spring constant and amount of potential energy because they are acting as separate springs. We also predicted the series configuration to be the easiest to pull with the smallest spring constant and amount of potential energy because the springs in the configuration are acting as one spring. It was determined that our predictions were correct. The parallel configuration had the highest spring constant and potential energy, and the series configuration had the lowest spring constant and potential energy. The model for our research question will be a force versus displacement graph because potential energy is equal to the area under the curve. 2 equations that express this model are the integral of force is equal to potential energy and the potential energy of a spring equation.
3 configurations of 3 springs were assembled using key rings and 3 springs with the same spring constant. Each configuration was pulled back to the same position each time. The force and displacement of each configuration was then measured using an IOLab and the IOLab software. One of the configurations was a parallel setup. The springs were attached to a key ring on each end with 3 springs on top of one another. One of the key rings was then attached to a string that was attached to an IOLab to measure the force and displacement of that configuration. Another configuration was in series with a key ring on each end and key rings in between each spring. This configuration was also attached to the IOLab by a string. The third configuration was a combination of series and parallel with key rings on each end and in between the 2 levels of strings. This configuration was also attached to the IOLab by a string. The force and displacement points were then taken from each trial and plotted on a scatter plot in Excel. The scatter plots were then used to determine the spring constant and integral of each configuration. These values were then used to determine the potential energy of each configuration.
For a system of 3 parallel springs, we found a relatively high spring constant of 17.75. When we took the integral, we found the potential energy to be about 0.087 joules. For our configuration of 3 springs in series, we found a relatively low spring constant of 2.138 and our integral giving us a potential energy of 0.0118. Our combination trial yielded results in the middle of the other 2, with a spring constant of 4.5171 and a potential energy of 0.0245 joules. In our trials, we found that the parallel configuration did have the highest potential energy at 0.087 joules, as well as the highest spring constant of 17.75. This matches our prediction, as the 3 springs each independently resisted the change in displacement. The series configuration had the smallest spring constant, 2.138, and the smallest potential energy, 0.0118 joules, since the springs acted as one and lessened the resistance. The combination was in between the 2, with a spring constant of 4.5171 and a potential energy of 0.0245 joules. In conclusion, having springs in parallel configurations increases the potential energy of the system, and putting springs in series configurations decreases potential energy of the system.